Welcome everyone to the 16th lecture in the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series. And today we'll have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Sool Park, who's going to speak on the histories of philosophies in the peripheries, the case of Korea. Park is a researcher in the DFG project, the Histories of Philosophies in a Global Perspective at the University of Hildesheim. He's also a lecturer in Korean literature at the University of Berlin and Bochum. And he has just published the book, Histories of Philosophy and Thought in Korean Language. And Park also works quite interestingly with Western philosophy, having translated quite a number of the 20th century works of 20th century philosophers like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. So we are very pleased that you could create time to be with us today, Park. And for speaking on this very interesting area of non-Western philosophy. And so you have our full attention, and you can please go ahead with your talk. I would just say, thank you all, you're already muted. Please just stay muted. After the talk, we'll have time for questions, and you can then ask your questions or make comments as well. So Sool, you have our attention.
Okay, thank you. Hello, good evening. My name is Sool Park. Elvis asked me to do a talk on Korean philosophy, and I decided to talk about my new book. So it's kind of selfish using this opportunity to talk about my new monography. But at the end, I actually was thinking about what Korean philosophy is and how I can talk about it at this time point. And my conclusion was, I don't know what it is. Yes, I mean, I don't think anybody actually knows what Korean philosophy is at this time. Even in Korea, there is, I think, no consensus of the question what Korean philosophy was, is, and might be. So I will be talking about histories of Korean philosophies written in the Korean language, not about the Korean philosophy itself. But I may begin with a non-academic maybe an anecdote about how the word or the concept of philosophy is perceived in Korea. I was working in Korea 8 years ago in Seoul. I was teaching philosophy at the military academy because I was an officer there. People asked me really frequently what I was doing for a living, and I talked to them. Of course, I was teaching philosophy, and some of them would answer me or ask me back, oh, that's great that you're teaching philosophy, because that's also what I'm doing. And those were people, sometimes there were older ladies or older people where you would not normally think they would do academic philosophy. So they would say they would go to these so-called philosophy centers. There are many philosophy centers or philosophy shops in Korea called 철학관. They really have this name philosophy in it. And when you go to one of these shops where the service is philosophy, you would see these kind of images or personalities there. These are people who would let you pay some 50 euros or something, and then to tell you your future, your destiny, based upon the ancient divination technique, based on the classical Chinese book of I Ching, or other techniques, traditional techniques, that is, of course, not academic philosophy in our sense. So what I want to show you here with this maybe a bizarre example is that the word Korean, the philosophy in Korea is kind of in a confusion. So you don't actually know if it's a traditional thought, if it's a religion, if it relates to modern academic activities. So with the word philosophy, you can sort of denote everything between the ancient mythologies divination techniques up to Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Derrida. So that's the situation of world philosophy in Korea currently. So that is just for the introduction, maybe, that you have a connection to the world philosophy in Korea. So I want to talk about the history of Korean philosophy because it is our project, of course, in the University of Hildesheim, where I'm a research a member. Our project is called Histories of Philosophy in a Global Perspective. You may be aware of it. We are collecting in our first phase of project various histories of philosophies in different languages. As you can see, we have some 22 languages, starting with ancient Greek and Arabic, Chinese, and so on, to Korean, Persian, Polish, Portuguese, and so on. So we have a huge list of histories or historical documents written in the respective languages, and we are catalogizing them and categorizing them so we can have an overview on non-European traditions of philosophical historiography. So we can analyze also the patterns of historical construction in diverse regions of the world. So, of course, our focus is to compare and also analyze, especially the non-European traditions in their historiographical self-depiction. So our first monography was on the Japanese philosophy, and my monography, of course, was on the Korean philosophy, or the history of philosophy and thought in Korean language. This is the book that was recently published like 2 months ago. It has a subtitle, Bibliographical Guide from the 8th Century to 2021. So there I collected numerous documents of on history of philosophy. I included also pre-modern documents. These are just 25 items, but nevertheless they extended the whole scope to as far as 8th century. So I have this huge span of some 13 centuries of Korean philosophy here. Mainly it's in the pre-modern period, it's Buddhism and Confucianism. In the modern period, you have all sorts of course, philosophies you will find also in the Western versions of philosophies, histories of philosophies. So our question today is, I will be, of course, presenting some contents of this book. The question is it possible to do a historiography of philosophy without centrisms, outside of Eurocentric perspective, outside of the Sinocentric perspective, and so on? And for this aim, you have to investigate the modes of self-sufficiency in the periphery, so regarding philosophy and thought. A special element in our research project is that we use language borders as criteria and not national borders. So that's the reason why the book is also called Histories of Philosophy and Thought in Korean Language. It's not in Korea. This has the advantage that you don't have the whole political problem related to national borders. For example, if you're talking about Tibetan philosophy or Vietnamese philosophy, you don't have the problem to ask yourself if it's potentially Chinese philosophy, because Tibet is, in a political sense, of course, Chinese right now, and so on. So these problems can be avoided, and you can also regard the factor of the language as the constituting factor in philosophy and thought, and also in the historiography of philosophy. And next step. So I have prepared some diagrams here. Of course, almost everything I found on philosophical history in Korean language is written in South Korea, but there is a small amount of documents written also in pre-modern and colonial era, and also in North Korea. There's a variety of themes they were interesting for the Korean historiography of philosophy. I'll just take a small example here on the left side. Maybe I sorted them in my book according to the regions and nations. You can see here that the European philosophy and Chinese philosophy have the most number of publications in the modern Korean language. So there is kind of a east-west distinction here, or the dichotomy working here. Also, of course, there's also a large number of publications on Korean philosophy. So these are the three the most regarded regions or traditions in the Korean historiography. So, and on the other hand, you can also see that outside of this east-west distinction, there's almost no interest for so-called peripheries of philosophy history. So regarding, for example, African philosophy or Latin American philosophy, or even Islamic or Jewish philosophy, there is very little interest. But this is a kind of the reflection of the current interest in Korea for other philosophies you can see in this database. Another interesting fact in this monography is the study is the role of translation. Actually, more than 40% of all the material written in South Korea is actually translated material from other languages. In following all the Japanese, English, Chinese, and other European languages. So it is also a reception process that is heavily influencing the picture of philosophy and history of philosophy in Korea. Also here you see the proportion is kind of half-half. So the East and the West are represented in a roughly same manner in the Korean history of philosophy. So that is roughly the information that can be drawn, statistically drawn from this study. Now I'll talk about a little bit about pre-modern histories of philosophy in Korea, written Korean language. We have, of course, this problem, what is pre-modern? I will just stipulate that pre-modern means 1900 in Korea. I don't want to discuss about this any longer because it's a bigger problem. But this is actually a quite good number to start with. Of course, there is this problem of language and also nationality of Korean philosophy, because virtually all the documents written in pre-modern Korea is also written in classical Chinese. Classical Chinese was the language of the written language of the elite. As well, both Buddhist and Confucianist tradition, these people were, of course, educated in classical Chinese and Chinese classics. So their philosophy was based upon the classical Chinese thought in one sense, and also the medium of their expression was classical Chinese. And so now the question is it Chinese philosophy or is it Korean philosophy? Because all the documents, or virtually all the documents, are have survived in the Chinese script. I had a long argumentation in my book to work around this problem. Long story short, I'll argument that the normal or the average Korean philosopher in the pre-modern time was bilingual, or was mastering a kind of a diglossia. So they actually thought in Korean, but wrote in classical Chinese. That was a way to argument that there's this kind of a hybrid language situation, which allows me to say that this is also a kind of Korean thought, Korean language in an extended sense. So even after the indigenous system of Hangul, so Korean script, was invented, this tendency to write in classical Chinese remains, and this is kind of very traditional factor that intensifies the connections to the Sinocentric tradition and to the classical Chinese thought. The most striking factor of pre-modern Korean philosophy and also the history of Korean philosophy is what I call origin histories. Origin histories means that you construct a historical line of thinkers, of schools, of thoughts, as a succession of the truths transmitted from master to masters, kind of a personal transmission of origin point of history from master to master, and as it succeeded to the successors of these truths, and it's until it reaches the current time point of the historiograph. I will give you a little example from China to see how extreme this could get. So this is a diagram of school lineage of Buddhas and patriarchs produced in the 13th century in China. And this is a diagram that depicts the genealogical lines of Buddhas, patriarchs, and masters and students. It contains more than 4,000 monks. Here you can see the actual interest of this historiographical tendency is to construct lineages of thinkers, of lineages of masters, and not linear development or progress of thoughts or debates. And this tendency to write origin histories, it's originated in China, this model in the Zen Buddhist historiography, roughly 8th century, is also comes also to Korea, and it comes to an adaptation and transformation of this idea of origin histories in Korea. So what the pre-modern historiographs of Buddhism and Confucianism do is actually also to construct lines of or lineages of masters of their own traditions. And of course, by doing so, they connect their own traditions to the origin points of truth, which always lies in China, Confucius, or in India, Buddha. In constructing these origin histories, they also construct themselves as a periphery of a center. So this inevitably a periphery mode of historiography. But in the next step, so as the political situation changes in East Asia, there is also a movement to liberate oneself from this centralistic or hegemonic historiographical model. I'll come back to that later. So there is kind of this is kind of a crude diagram I produced today to make the point today. It may be the interesting breaking point or the interesting difference between the Eurocentric view and the pre-modern East Asian view on history of philosophy. So the standard narrative, the Eurocentric view, as we know it from Hegel or Tennemann, it's somehow it begins in ancient Greece, but it then progresses through time toward then kind of a universal rationality. Also, the newest history of philosophy written by Habermas follows this model. It somehow starts in an origin point in Mediterranean area, but at the end it all converges against this one Vernunft, this one universal rationality that is the general solution to all problems of the philosophical world. This is kind of a linear progress model that is a fundamental perspective of the Eurocentric perspective, whereas at the downside you see a very different model where Tao, which can be translated maybe as truth, is at the origin point, is always kind of declining, is depressing, and through the progress of time, there is this movement to resist this entropy of decline of the truth. So at the end of, or at this certain point of the history of philosophy, if a master is a real master, he would personify the Tao itself. So if you say Zhu He or Song Xiao or any other Confucian philosopher has reached a high point in his philosophical knowledge or truth, that means he is at the same level at the starting point. Yes. So this is kind of a model where you keep returning to the original point, rather than progressing to something different or something better or something advanced through the time. So maybe this may be the basic difference in the model of history. So I will go to some example of this model of original history in Korean philosophy. For example, in the Buddhism, you have, I will show you the oldest document I found written in Korea, 8th century, Goseungjeon, which roughly translates to biographies of eminent monks. The original is lost, but we know from other sources that the book has existed and also contained exclusively Korean masters. So this is kind of a lineage of eminent masters in Korea. And of course, this ensures the existence of Buddhist truth in Korea, and also the tradition of Buddhist truth in Korea that is secured also outside of India and China and so on. Of course, it's also modeled after the same after work, Chinese work with the same title, but at the same time, it's kind of a reflection that tries to. It's not a national identity, but a cultural identity of the Korean Buddhism. This is, of course, an old document I found here, but also at the current time. So now they're, I'll show this in this way maybe. It's just rather confusing. This is the current version of the current standard version of the Buddhist history in Korea. So this is the official version of the Choge order, this is the main Buddhist organization in Korea, and they have this representation of the Buddhist history that leads directly from Buddha. At the very upside, you see Buddha Shakyamuni, and it goes to China. This is the famous Zen master Huineng in the 8th century. And leads, of course, at the end, at the downside, to the current representative of the Korean Buddhism, called Jinja. He is still alive and is still very actively promoting this view that he is actual successor of Buddha himself. So this kind of original history, consisting of biographies or consisting of materials on individual thinkers, reconstructed in a lineage of master to master, it will at the end give you the evidence that our tradition, or this tradition, is in possession of the orthodox lineage, and our master is the rightful successor of Buddha himself. So this is this may be the philosophical interest or philosophical aim of these historical systems to produce the evidence of the orthodoxity of one's position. Similar things happen in Korean Confucianism. To begin with, I will show you this one old map, 1402. This is a map of whole Eurasia as it was known at the time point to Koreans. This is a map. This is a huge map, like 3 meters, and it also hung in the hall of palace. So this is the official worldview of the Confucian at the time. And at the right side, you see Korean Peninsula, rather big. And in the center, you see this huge enlarged version of a Chinese continent. And the left side, you see also Europe. So this is kind of compact version of Central Asia, India, Africa, and Europe. So this is the whole world that is known. And the main information we extract from this worldview is that it is Sinocentric. So China is in the center, it's the middle of the world, and Korea is located near enough to it, so it receives the philosophical truth that originates from China. And according to this worldview, of course, all the endeavors in the philosophical historiography goes in the direction that you would try to reconstruct your history in a way that it connects with the sinocentric worldview. So you have to stay connected with the Chinese masters. So work like this, by one of the most influential philosophers in medieval Korea, Li Huang, complete records of Neo-Confucianism, of Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. This is a huge work. I think it has some 12 volumes, I think. He kind of depicts and includes and excludes all the relevant Confucian scholars of China. So the author is sitting in Korea, but he is actually making a list of Chinese philosophers, and he is constructing a lineage of Chinese philosophers for Korea, which is a really peripheral kind of history he's doing here, because what he is doing here is constructing an orthodoxy of Chinese Confucianism in a very extreme way to show that his knowledge is so wide and so deep that he is connected with the center in a historiographical sense. What is interesting here is he also has one volume of that contains only Confucianist scholars who should be excluded because they're not orthodox enough. So we see here this kind of lineage construction is mainly about inclusion and exclusion. So these mechanisms of inclusion and exclusions is very crucial to the construction of a philosophical history. Of course, later on, there will be other books, other histories of Confucianism in Korea where one will try to include Korean philosophers. One will try to reconstruct lineages of Korean philosophers with a kind of a national consciousness. Before I talk about more books written in classical Chinese, I will try a visualization here. Like I said, they try to construct a lineage of Korean philosophers, Korean Confucianists, and the best example for this is this the central Confucius temple in Seoul, where all the sages are honored. So in this building, you will find all the Confucianist sages and philosophers in a very specific constellation, of course, in accordance with the importance of the individual Confucianists. So this is how it looks like inside. There will be tables and these etiquettes. I will show you the Latinist version. Of course, in the middle you have Confucius and his four main masters, and the 10 disciples of Confucius and the 6 sages of Song Dynasty. But at the very outside, so at the periphery of this hall, you have the 18 sages of the East, which is nothing else than the 18 Korean sages. So after they have canonized all the Chinese masters, they have added their own masters of Confucianism in the very periphery. So they are very exact in this hierarchy of center and periphery. In the middle, of course, the Chinese masters, and at the outside, one has placed oneself, so to say, in periphery. So this is kind of a performative, or the also the ritual canonization of sages and scholars. There's a long debate who is to be included, who is to be excluded. Political debates to delete some names or add some names. After the liberation from Japanese Empire, the Koreans then tried to delete all the Chinese masters because Confucianism is Korean and so on. So this is a object of political debate also. But at the end, this is still the same historical framework of origin history, because you are constructing a lineage of masters that leads back to the center or the origin point of philosophical truth. So at the right hand side, you see this bigger picture of Confucius, and the left side, you see the Korean masters, and so on. So this is how it's done in the Confucianist discourse. As a last point, I want to point out to one little thought on Korean shamanism. I didn't include this thought in the monography because there's not enough evidence in the academic side. But if you talk about Korean philosophy, I think it's similar in the Chinese philosophy. You always talk about Korean Buddhism and Korean Confucianism because they're textual traditions, because they're heavy institutions with rich textual evidence. Also, they have produced a huge volume of texts, but at the same time, there is also shamanism, which was highly important in Korea, which is still today important on a cultural and a religious level. It is not only ritual that gets performed in Korea, but is also consists of oral traditions. It's also a huge convolute of transmitted mythologies and narratives. They can be accessed through this tradition. It's also cosmologically interesting. This is a funny altar picture of deities of Korean shamanism. You see in the middle, for example, Buddha, yes, and at the left hand side you will have all the Confucian masters. At the right side you will have the Korean masters, and so on. So this is kind of a syncretism what's happening here. They have a rich mythological and cosmological potential in a philosophical sense, which has not been validated yet, and this is something which has to be done if you will be talking about real Korean philosophy that is really inclusive, which I think is also important because shamanism in Korea is a female thing. Yes, I mean, all the shamans in Korea were women. It's a female tradition, also transmitted from master to master, but all the masters were, of course, women who were, of course, also excluded from Confucianism and Buddhism because women were not allowed to read and write. So they have this oral instrument of transmitting their own thoughts and their worldviews. This is kind of a part of the Korean thought, religion that is largely neglected also in Korea itself. I think if you're interested in doing Korean philosophy in the framework of world philosophy, Korean shamanism is one of the elements that should be included in the future. So I think I've talked enough. I don't know if it is comprehensive. It's a little bit chaotic, I think, because I had not the time to do the preparation today. But yes, I think I'll just end here, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Sool. Yeah, it wasn't maybe as chaotic as you think. It's very interesting, particularly the last point you make about shamanism and the very idea that it had female. Well, it doesn't seem right to say female masters, although they were still called masters, and also the fact that it's the one that has less representation in history because it doesn't have a textual history. Perhaps that's the very first thing I would like to ask. Please, if you have any question, feel free to raise your hand. But I was just wondering, were there other ways in which the history of shamanism were preserved through symbols, through orality, rather than through text? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, there is a very lively tradition that is still active in Korea. So there are really huge population of shamans still practicing. And of course, there is this endeavor starting from the 70s to collect all the songs and the mythologies in textual form. So after it has been textualized, scripturalized, you have this access for academic philosophy, yes, because it's just kind of ironic maybe, but the oral tradition has to be scripturalized in a sense to become academic. And maybe it's also against the whole spirit. But I think that's what's happening right now. At the other side, shamanism was always kind of repressed by the Confucianist government because it was regarded as a superstition. It's a woman's thing. It's not logical. It's not philosophical. So it's all the arguments we have actually against non-European philosophies in our tradition were used against this kind of shamanist practice, even though they had this rich reservoir of cosmologies and mythologies and also literature they were producing. Yes, so
yeah, very interesting. Because I'm doing a monograph on African philosophy, and this is exactly the point I'm making about textualism, the strict adherence to text by the gatekeepers of philosophy. Why must it be that way, considering that the repositories of philosophical knowledge that we depend on are not just text. We draw them from symbols, from orality, and perhaps we also need to rethink how inclusive repositories of philosophical knowledge are. Anyway, we have two hands up. I have to begin with Peter Simiri. Thanks, Peter, for joining.
Hello, I don't know, it's afternoon over there or evening. I would say good evening, good afternoon. Thank you, Sool, for that very thought-provoking presentation. I think what you have done for us is to give us a window into Korean philosophy. And I find it very interesting that when you look at the list of areas of interest that you have provided on the screen, African philosophy only has one publication. And I know that several years ago, one of my teachers, I was an undergraduate then, as soon as he finished his PhD, he moved to South Korea. And I'm wondering whether you have quite a number of Africans teaching philosophy in Korea. And if that's the case, how come we have only one publication listed for African philosophy? That's the first question. The other question has to do with the issue you raised about the need to include some of the works of shamanists, in the world philosophy. I think African philosophy has that problem too. Sometimes people talk about what they call Ifakopos in Yoruba philosophy, where there's a particular set of philosophical ideas that you can find in, some people say it's a religious practice. Others will say, well, it's more than religion. There's something philosophical about what they do. So the question for me is, how do you separate between that which is philosophical and that which doesn't fall within that category when you look at shamanism? Thank you. I think that's my question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really odd, and it's also shameful that the interest for non-European and non-East Asian philosophy is not very present in Korea. I think I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, so I think the biggest problem in Korea is, or in East Asia in general, is here's the Eurocentric perspective is just substituted by the Eurocentric and Sinocentric perspective. It is kind of an East-West dichotomy working here. there is only, the philosophy only exists in the West, so the European sphere, or in the East, which is India and China and Korea, Japan. So this is kind of the worldview that is actively shaping the understanding of philosophy in Korea, which is, of course, yeah, it really needs a corrective in this sense. I think this one book on African philosophy is by I think this is the book Philosophy and Religion in Africa, Mbiti, I think, and this is also published in the 80s or something. There has been virtually no work on this in this field. This sort of first thing, and the second question, how to distinguish between philosophy and religion, or philosophy and shamanism. I think philosophy is, as we've seen in this exclusion mechanism in Korea itself, that the Confucians were using this kind of argument. Shamanism is not logical, shamanism is superstition, and so on. This is more an exclusion mechanism than a objective description. So my instinction is here just to not to take the word philosophy in an objective sense. Yes, this is some historical construction we have there, and in the process of inclusion, we will expand the borders of the concept. So same with the shamanism. I don't think anybody in Korea is including shamanism into the history of philosophy, and I think we should argument from the global perspective toward the fact that toward the inclusion of these traditions also in Korea, so oral traditions, these repressed traditions in the pre-modern Korea.
Thank you, Sool. We'll take the next two questions. Thomas first, and then Imogen after. Hi, Thomas, can you hear us? We can't hear you for some reason. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better now.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, it was my earphones. So anyhow, thank you very much, Sool, for this fascinating lecture and the description of your project, which is absolutely immense and very much relevant to my own work. And my, well, 2 or 3 questions, but it's actually one thematic block. So, and it's related to what Peter just asked a minute ago. And basically, when I took a look at this total publication lists in South Korea, the first 2 positions piqued my interest, namely the entangled histories and the global histories. Because you see, in my own work at SOAS, at my doctoral dissertation, I wrote an basically interdisciplinary and often methodologically comparative comparative dissertation on the possibilities of status and class-based mobility in Joseon era among non-elites, about the sons of concubines, about the various commoners and the chungin. And when I started working my dissertation, one of the major problems when I started going through the different materials and also discussing with scholars is whether it is simple or morally acceptable to try to compare Korean indigenous philosophy, I mean indigenous in the sense of reinterpretations of Confucianism, such as by Ihuan Tuegie, by Yulgoch, and so on, and you comparing this heritage through the lens of Western philosophy, that there was different voices, both from professional scholars, I mean from researchers of the intellectual history, and also of some from the post-colonial trends, that this is a problem. They were saying that this is a problematic ground, and that is some kind of autonomy or some separated respect, I don't know how to term that, should be accorded to Korean philosophy, and that some comparative methodologies shouldn't be applied. And and at the same time, I remembered words of such important scholars such as Martina Deuchler, you no doubt know of her, who in the introduction to one of her major books, The History of Korea, she says that when the historical data is lacking for description of some sociological or philosophical trend, we might substitute that with, well, some anthropological theories, some from methodologies, not from the directed field. So in this case, not from Korean history and culture per se. So as you can see, I faced multiple dilemmas in that case. So if the first issue is, how do you feel about the presence of comparative philosophical methodologies and comparative books in modern, like modern South Korean publishing houses? That's the first question. And the second interrelated question to also what Peter asked a while ago is about the perception of well, unorderly of some intuitive or abstract thought as in the dichotomy between Confucianism and shamanism, like we discussed. Because in the discipline I am currently researching, like in relation to East Asian philosophy and Korean philosophy, the discipline of posthumanism, there is a drive towards questioning the humanistic or the civilizational, cultural underpinnings of human activity, and by extension of creation of philosophy. And I just wanted to, I'm just curious if at all you have encountered posthumanism discourse in modern South Korea, or in the materials you have analyzed as part of your project, and if some dichotomies between the cultural, the high culture Confucianism, or the wild, like you said, dark village style shamanism have been pinpointed. Because once again, to make things shorter, posthumanism is just simply questioning of the rationale of the role of human rationale and humanism in creation of well, written works and so on. So that's the two issues I was just curious about.
Okay, I don't know if I can answer your questions because they're very special, and I'm not an absolute expert in Korean philosophy. I'm actually an European philosopher in my education. So, but I'll do my best. So regarding this comparative view between the European philosophy and mostly this neo-Confucian thinkers, Toege Yuhang and Ryugo-gi, they're the examples of Korean philosophy, which is actually constructed by the colonial scholars in the 20s and 30s, because when they were investigating the Korean philosophy, I mean, they actually created something like Korean philosophy in the colonial perspective, and their aim was, of course, to show that Korean philosophy is something minor, something inferior. And they focused on this Toege Yuhang and Ryugo-gi, this discourse on Li-ji, Simseonglon, which is a very abstract, really complex kind of also metaphysical debate in Joseon Dynasty. They wanted to show that this kind of unproductive and overly theoretical, overly metaphysically loaded discourse has led Joseon to its own fall. So this was the narrative they were constructing then, and this was kind of constructed as the center of the Korean philosophy, and it again led to the perspective that Buddhism is not as important as the Confucianism, and shamanism is not logical, and so on. So this is kind of exclusion mechanisms made by an exclusion mechanism in the colonial perspective, which is not really discussed in the current Korean discourse. I mean, we know that this the starting point of historical reconstruction of Korean philosophy comes from the Japanese scholars Takahashi Toru, most renowned scholar at that time point at the Imperial University in Seoul. Yes, and he was collecting materials to prove his thesis that this kind of void and overly scholar nothingness thinking was the middle point of Korean philosophy. So of course, it has this theoretical character, and it has this highly intellectual character that can be compared to some aspects of maybe medieval Thomism in a sense, and that makes it maybe accessible for European scholars. But at the same time, I think it's the reproduction of this Eurocentric view in a double way. In the first way is it constructs Korean philosophy as a scripture tradition, as a purely scripture tradition that is purely theoretical and metaphysical. But at the other side, it characterizes executive discourse as something inferior, because it's so theoretical. So this is a double movement that's happening there in the colonial perspective, which we call 민족사관. So 민족사관, this is 식민사관, this colonial historical perspective. The second question, I think is too overwhelming for me, and there are also other questions.
No, it's a rising to discipline. I know. It's somewhat problematic for everyone because that poses multiple interpretative issues here.
I don't think any one of us have any explicitly clear answer to that question. Comparative philosophy, it's a real problem. Imogen and then Isabel.
Hi, sorry, I'll just put my camera on. So thank you for a really interesting lecture. I almost missed it, but I'm so glad that I didn't. I really enjoyed that, so thank you.
Thank you.
And my question is, I was just wondering, I don't know how to phrase this. Do you think in focusing on and perhaps searching for Korean philosophers in history that we may have missed because of the way the historiography and everything we were talking about works, do you think that we may incur some risk of missing those who are actually in the present? Or maybe a better way to put that would be that those who are in the present are focusing so much on history that then the useful things that they could contribute and ideas that could be put forward about the present world that we live in are perhaps missed in favor of looking at history. I'm not saying that looking at history isn't important. I was just wondering this. And in this way, we actually kind of perpetuate the loss, or maybe loss is the wrong word, but we'll go with that for now. The loss of Korean history, because we...
I get your point, So the word philosopher, 철학자, is kind of reserved for dead people in Korea. Yes, I mean it's not. You don't use the word for alive people in Korea. You can say maybe Habermas is a philosopher. I don't think any Korean that's still alive can be called a philosopher in Korea, which also reflects this linguistic fact. I think reflects the tendency to put the whole discipline of philosophy into the past. This is something that is our tradition. Is something that already happened in the past, and what we are doing is just like we're categorizing them, we're studying them. So there is this temporal rupture maybe between the past and the present. This is a really nice point, because I don't know which personalities would qualify as philosophers in modern Korea. I mean, the whole Buddhist masters or the Confucian scholars who are still active today, nobody will call them philosophers. It's really odd, because it's really odd. When you ask it, it's just kind of can come to my consciousness right now that it's not possible to call them philosophers.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
It is also interesting for me right now. It's giving me new thoughts.
It is very interesting, very, very interesting. A lot to think about that. Isabel?
Well, thank you very much. I'm turning the camera on as
Hi.
well because it's more convenient. Thank you. I have a question about, in your book, do you describe the shift in the presentation of the history of Korean philosophy and especially Confucianism? Because you talked about the origin histories, which is very true and relevant. But I mean the rewriting of the history of Korean philosophy in the 20th century, because they tend to, as you said, to take the colonial perspective or the nationalistic perspective, saying that because it was really theoretical and really, you know, highly elaborate thinking, they are, I mean, Confucian writings were at the same level as, let's say, European discussions. And so the status of philosophy should be granted to Korean tradition. So there is this style of writing, but also recently, there is other ways of presenting, like around debates and especially around some icons. I mean, it's not the line of transmission, but it's more about some individuals. So like, you know, Hegel, or it's the same logic to highlight some people like genius minds and cut precisely from the line of transmission. So there is this tendency. So do you explain that in your book? And the second question is also about really contemporary philosophy in Korea. Is there South Korean philosophy today? I mean, not reflecting on the tradition, but or comparative philosophy, but truly Korean reflection in philosophy. And who are these people? Are they teaching in the philosophy department of a university, or are they public intellectuals? And no. Thank you.
I actually wrote about this transition period in the colonial period, of course, where the whole Confucians like Zhang Jian are starting to write Yugyo Yonwan, and they're like they're still writing in classical Chinese. They're still kind of sticking to this origin history thinking, but then they have also narrative of decline. We lost sovereignty because we were sticking to this ideology and so on. So these are kind of temporalized concept of philosophy that comes into the narrative in this period, which is really new, which was new at that time point, because until then it was just a search for the origin point and so on. What then happens in the really modern era right now, if there are focuses on genius individuals in the philosophy, I'm aware of this discussion about Chon Ya-kyung, of course, one of the most promoted philosophers from Korea, as also because he's the amalgamation point between the European and Korean philosophy. These figures are, of course, of interest. But to think about your last question, I think this goes in the similar direction as the question before yours. Are there contemporary philosophers in Korea? It's the question that strikes me. I mean, we have Han Byung-chul, but obviously he identifies with his German nationality, and there's Kim Jae-in, but he is kind of more a Derrida expert than an original thinker. I mean, I regard the Buddhist masters actually as more qualified as original thinkers. Figures like Songchul or Sungsan, who are also translating their works into English, or they were also teaching in English and so on, internationally active. Maybe that line of thought or philosophy is more original, or kind of more indigenous. I don't know how to phrase this, but the religious thinkers, and also the so-called Shinung Jonggyo, yes, I mean figures like Choi Jae-woo or these new religions in the colonial period. Of course, they were producing genuinely new and also as marked as Korean, yes, sort of a philosophy in the beginning of the last century. And those are, I think, are still uninvestigated areas of thought in the Korean philosophy, because only recently they started to regard some movements such as Donghak or Cheondogyo or all these half religion, half philosophy, maybe text corpus as philosophy. And the relationship between these new thoughts, new lines of thought, and the traditional thoughts, as well as to the modern thought, is still very unclear. And there's no grand narrative to put all these diverse elements in one line. And I think we're actually at the point where we're looking for this kind of grand narrative to include them all. And I think this is also a reason why we don't have a history of philosophy, Korean philosophy in a Western language, because there is just no consensus how to categorize them, how to put them into a consistent line of narratives. So, like I said in the beginning, even I don't know what Korean philosophy is, who Korean philosophers might be. Am I one? I don't know. So this is, I think I'm just trying to be honest here, and this reflects kind of the tendency also in Korea.
Yeah, I mean, your recent book is a very important contribution to an attempt to bring Korean philosophy to a much more global audience, I would say. And I mean, perhaps one final question would be from me. Why did you title it Histories of Philosophy and Thought? Is the thought more encompassing than philosophy? Is philosophy not synonymous with thought? Why not just history of philosophy in the Korean language? Why history of philosophy and thought in Korean language? Yeah,
that's of course a historical thing, because you have two words in Korea if you're doing intellectual history: 철학사, which is history of philosophy, and 사상사, which is history of thoughts. But both words are from the Japanese language, so they are kind of colonial residue still remaining in the Korean language. But you have to reflect also these historical constructions. I see actually no difference between them, but there are scholars who are very sensitive about the difference. They say, for example, Hobbes is more a thinker, not a philosopher. And Nietzsche is, of course, a philosopher. So there seems to be a distinction between the two terms, but yes, it's more historically constructed, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's quite it reveals this sort of it's similar to this sort of colonial constructions as well with Western encounter with African culture. So there seem to be more Western philosophers seem to be more comfortable to say African thought rather than African philosophy. It seems okay. It seems okay to say thought rather than philosophy. Yeah, it's just an interesting connection there. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sool. Very interesting lecture, interesting conversations as well. Definitely new things we've learned, new things to think about. I think that's the whole point of these conversations we have. And hopefully when we're able to put this on the YouTube page, we can have a look at it again and play around with some concepts that you've touched on today. So thank you so much for creating the time to be with us and to have this lecture. And thank you all who have attended. Looking forward to a lecture at the end of June. And then usually we'll not have for July and August in summer, but then we'll resume again in September. So I look forward to seeing as many of you at the end of June. And thank you again, Sool. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.